Great. Well, I've been enjoying the conversation. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jeff Shantz. I'm the Vice President for Institutional Advancement, Chief of Staff at Albany Law. It's great to see so many of you on the call today and so many more that'll continue to log on. We want to welcome our alumni and our friends to the book launch and celebration of the release of the new book, Crisis Lawyering, Effective Legal Advocacy in Emergency Situations, which is the fruit of the collaboration between Albany Law School and the University at Albany. And to formally welcome us all here today, I would like to introduce Albany Law School's president and dean. She is certainly a leader in legal education. She's championed the value of law schools as drivers of change in our communities and society and the lives of our students and graduates. As our president and dean, she's presided over Albany Law School's execution of our successful strategic plan and the launch of a new one, fulfillment of an institutional affiliation, which is apropos today with the University at Albany, and expansion into our online graduate programs, and of course, the launch of our record-setting fundraising campaign, We Rise Together, the campaign for Albany Law School. And as mentioned, has helped us get through this pandemic and get us back to in-person learning and doing it in a great way. And so, ladies and gentlemen, our 18th president and dean of Albany Law School, Ms. Alicia Willett.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everyone. It's great to see you all. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm excited to join you as we celebrate the release of Crisis Lawyering, Effective Legal Advocacy in Emergency Situations. This new book is co-edited by our very own, very talented, very amazing Professor Ray Brescia and a terrific colleague from the University of Albany, Professor Eric Stern. Professors Brescia and Stern bring cross-disciplinary expertise through their research and teaching. As Jeff Shantz noted, that it's important to highlight that this book is a product of the affiliation between Albany Law School and the University at Albany. The affiliation brings innovative academic opportunities to students, as well as research and grant prospects for faculty. The book came together beginning in 2017 as Professor Brescia and Professor Stern worked to recruit a diverse group of legal scholars and experienced practitioners representing different civil rights organizations, government organizations, first responder agencies, and academic institutions. It covers many important and timely crisis topics, such as intimate partner violence, immigrants in detention centers, natural disasters, climate change, and more. The book couldn't be more relevant and timely if it tried. It seems that every day we're faced with new and unexpected crises that inevitably raise with them important legal questions and challenges. It is the lawyers that are the problem solvers. And it's critical that as lawyers and as future lawyers, we have the necessary training and understanding to be effective during these extraordinary situations. The book has already received a great deal of positive attention to everyone involved on that. The attention is a testament not only to the importance of the topics covered in the book, but to the hunger in the legal community and beyond for tools and tactics for lawyering through crisis situations. What's more, preparing our students to be lawyers and leaders in the face of the many challenges that the world faces is at the heart of the mission of Albany Law School. And this edited collection couldn't come at a more important time for our school, the legal profession, the nation, and the world. I want to thank Professor Brescia and Professor Stern and all of our panelists today and acknowledge all of the incredible work that went into bringing this work to reality. Finally, I want to acknowledge the tremendous panel we have for today's program. I'd like to thank our two co-editors, as well as alumnus and board of trustee member, Mr. David McCraw, class of 1992, Lee Wang from the Immigrant Defense Project, and Professor Sarah Rogerson Director of the Justice Center at Albany Law School. Their complete bios are in the program. I'm not going to read them to you here. I would take up the whole time for the presentation. These are very accomplished, wonderful people. So with that, I will turn this over, the Zoom square over to our Master of Ceremonies for the day, my colleague and one of the co-editors of the book, Professor Ray Brescia. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and congratulations to all of you who are responsible for this important and timely work.
Thank you very much, Dean Willett. It is our pleasure to be here as a group and to speak with all of you today. We've got other contributors who are not on the panel. We've got current students, former students, we've got board members, we've got practicing lawyers, people just interested in these issues. So thank you all for joining us. There are many more thanks that have to be extended. First off, to Dean Willett and Dean Mayer for their support of this initiative and all the leadership at UAlbany as well. Anne Marie Murray, who has since gone on to retirement, I understand, but she was a critical member of the team, the affiliation team, and this project would not have happened without the vision of both institutions to look for ways to collaborate in an interdisciplinary fashion. And this is, I think, an example of that collaboration. Thank you to all the contributors. Again, some of whom are here, but many more are not. And it was their life's work in many ways that brought the book to life, and our ability to highlight that work was a great honor for Eric and myself. There were many students who helped with editing and reviewing chapters and doing blue booking and all that fun stuff. Alex Marie Baez, Claire Burke, Jake Island, Hannah Hage, Lauren McCluskey, Lauren Wilt, Victoria Sirocco, Francis Pellicchiero, all great students who just did so much work on this, and we're completely grateful for that. Similarly, Sherry Meyer, I mean, what happened to the law school that Sherry doesn't touch and make better? And her hands are all over this project, and we're so grateful to her support for this. For this event, Lisa Rivage, Ben Myers, Bill Purcell, and Jeff Saber wouldn't have happened without all of them. Another person that this never would have happened without is my co-editor, Eric. We didn't know each other before this project happened. We were put in touch through someone who knew both of us at UAlbany. I think in about 5 minutes, the idea for the project came together, and then we, just worked on it and got, friends and colleagues and associates to contribute. And it really, it's been a pleasure working with you. I think we really complement each other really well. Thanks also to Albany Ale and Oyster, where Eric and I would go every couple of months before pre-pandemic to work through issues and over a porter and some oysters, a pretzel or two to help work things out. So when all of this is behind us and we can celebrate again, I hope folks will join us for a pint at Ale and Oyster, which would be really great. But before we get started, Ernest, Eric, I want to pass the mic to you if you want to acknowledge folks that I have not already, or if you want to double my acknowledgement.
Well, I'll try not to cover too much of the same ground. First of all, I would like to thank Ray, of course. It was Elizabeth Gray, formerly of College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity, and then the Provost's office, who introduced us. And she thought we would hit it off, and we did indeed. This was a work that just seemed so timely, and it built off of different things that Ray and I had worked on in the past. And so as we started kicking ideas around, it really picked up momentum, and it wasn't a hard vision to sell. I would like to thank the University at Albany the affiliation fund as well, the Dean's Office and my colleagues at the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity, students that helped to organize some of the workshops and seminars. Ray and his colleagues at Albany Law have been just a pleasure to work with, and enjoyed the different exchanges that we've had, both in person and technology facilitated like this. I would like to thank just one other person who is a contributor to the volume, but it's the person who got me interested in this topic. I was contacted now maybe 10 years ago by the then Chief Counsel of FEMA, Brad Kaiserman, who is now the Vice President for Disaster Operations at the American Red Cross. And he expressed a concern that lawyers were not being trained to deal with the rigors of crises of the kind that, say, the Federal Emergency Management Agency was dealing with. And he wondered whether we could take good practices from the field of crisis studies and to try to better enable lawyers in this area. And unfortunately, Brad isn't with us today, which is unfortunate. Hopefully, you'll get to meet him on another occasion. But he was both a wonderful, accomplished lawyer and a wonderful leader, and really got me started on this path that led to today. So I will thank him in absentia. And I will stop there and look forward to the conversation we're going to have today.
Awesome. So we are, formally, CLE is available to folks who stay on the program throughout the program. We'll give codes out in a little bit, and then you'll get affidavits if you haven't already gotten them to fill out an affidavit and then evaluation. So that if you don't already have it, you will, and then I will give the code out. But we're not going to do a sort of, each of our wonderful panelists sort of speaking for 15 minutes and then, having just a few minutes for conversation. We're going to have, it's all conversation. So I'm going to start with my colleague, Professor Rogerson, and your work. So give us sort of the framework for your chapter, what you were working on in the Capital Region. And I understand that the sort of seeds for your work actually started with a student, Chris Scoville, and sort of who saw an opportunity. And then, I think it's easy to say that lawyers dealing with, the representation of immigrants, there are crises all the time. What made the crisis that you wrote about different? Why was that time different? And so set the stage for us a little bit and tell us of the origins of the program, and then sort of what felt different to you. Why was it, crisis lawyering to you?
Sure. So you're correct that a student brought this all to fruition, came into my office, was actually volunteering as a pro bono club president. He wanted to start the Immigration Pro Bono Club. And he had been visiting our local jail, the Albany County Jail, with a faith-based group, sitting with detainees. At the time, we did not realize that immigrants were being held at the Albany County Jail. And I think it's important to mention that one of the products of all of this is that there are no longer any immigrants held at the Albany County Jail, which is a really important thing to note. But back in 2013, the student said to me, I'm visiting with these folks. Did you know that there were immigrants in there? Can we do something about it? And I said, no, I did not know that. It's doubtful that we can do anything about it, but let's give it a try. I mean, this is a great learning opportunity. So the students, I said, you go ahead and pitch the sheriff, put it together, tell them what you'd like to do. And the idea at the time was just to connect people with counsel and referral services, make sure that they were being well taken care of, make sure that they had all the information that they needed. And it started out small with students visiting on a regular basis at the jail. We had already started with best practices, accumulating best practices, because we asked other clinical programs if we could borrow their intake forms to make sure that we were asking the right questions. And so students had done this for years and years. And we had a mini crisis when about 30 to 45 women were brought in from the Buffalo detention facility, a federal detention facility in Buffalo a couple of years later. And this blew the doors off of that crisis because in that situation, it was 30 to 45 women, all from the same country, all speaking the same language. What happened here was quite different. So we're used to, in immigration world, constant crises. And it's not, it's on a regular basis. I have elected officials or family members in my phone saying someone got, and this isn't usually under the Trump administration, but not always, under previous administrations as well. A loved one has been picked up by immigration or something has happened to them and we need to respond to it now. It's not every day that I hear from a stakeholder in the community saying, this is an opportunity to provide access to justice for a large group of people that would otherwise be not served from another part of the country. And that's what happened. So I was in an Amtrak train car on my way to New York City to teach a class at the New York Times for their summer fellows. I'm going to bring it all together with Camille Mackler, who Lee knows quite well, who was on the ground during the Muslim ban at JFK. I'm writing this book chapter, this very book chapter, but I'm calling it something different. I'm calling it palliative care because that's what it felt like we were offering to people at the jail. We were getting them ready to be deported, essentially, and very few people had legal options available to them. And I'm in the middle of drafting the introduction to this book chapter, and I get a call from the Albany County Sheriff, Craig Apple, which doesn't happen very often. And I thought, oh, great, here's another emergency. So I let it go to voicemail, to be honest, because I wanted to get a sense of what was going on. It was in the quiet car, so I actually had to run to the only place that I knew that I could get to, which was the bathroom. Called the sheriff back because it sounded urgent. And he said, what do you say we help out with the border? Remember, this was the time that they had the family separation crisis was happening in full swing. The ProPublica tapes had just been released. And he said, I think we're going to get about 30 to 40 people every couple of weeks. Do you think the local service providers can handle that? I know you've partnered before to help that number of people. What do you think we can do? And of course, the federal government had lied to him. And instead of 30 to 45 phased out over several weeks, we ended up with over 350 people brought to the Albany County Jail within a matter of weeks, speaking 11 different languages from 27 different countries, and had to coordinate a legal response that was compassionate, thorough, and based on best practices that were being developed at the border, because from a legal standpoint, these folks were pre-credible fear interview, which meant they hadn't gone through the regular processes that happen at the border. And luckily, and we'll talk about this more later, I hope, but there was already an existing network that had been working at the border that we could bring and borrow their policies, procedures, intake forms, and use that in the jail. So
in many ways, it was a change of scale, right? And also the complexity of the work. As you said before, it sounded like some of the women who had been brought in, at least they spoke the same language, but they may have been from the same region, if not the same country. Now you're dealing with a very different type of crisis than the one that you had been prepared to deal with.
That's exactly right. And also the potential for impact, which we wouldn't realize, and we're still realizing as things unfold. And I can talk about that more later. But we're expecting another wave in New York of people from what was called the Migrant Protection Protocol. The refugee camps at the border have just been mostly evacuated, and we expect hundreds of those folks are going to end up in New York State. So I can talk more about that later. But it's bringing up all of, where are our databases? Let's bring back the network that we had from 2 years ago and see how to respond in a non-detained setting.
So, let's turn, Lee, so very similar, I think, your organization, Immigrant Defense Project, really was created out of crisis, right? Sort of late 90s, early 2000s, in the wake of the welfare reform and some of the harsher elements of that with respect to immigrants. So what made the crisis you talked about, what made it different from the sort of run-of-the-mill crises that your organization has dealt with over the last 20 years?
Yeah, so I feel like there's a glib answer and then there's a more thoughtful answer. I mean, in some ways, the glib answer is Trump. And in some ways, I think I could say that, the 4 years of Trump was just one never-ending crisis for so many of us, and particularly for immigrants living with, his deliberate campaign of terror. But I will start with the lead, sort of the good news lead, copying Sarah, because I think it is important to mention this, that one thing that makes this really different is that we won. And that doesn't happen for, immigrant advocates very often, unfortunately.
What'd you win? Tell us. Those
so what we won is, keeping you all in suspense. After a 3-year statewide campaign, involving defenders and survivors of intimate partner violence and DAs and judges and just sort of a huge diversity of organizations coming together, we won several things. Number one, we won an injunction from a federal judge prohibiting ICE from making arrests at New York State courthouses without a judicial warrant. And then just this past December, Governor Cuomo finally signed into law the Protect Our Courts Act, which makes it unlawful for ICE to arrest non-citizens as they are attending court. So without a judicial warrant. So it's a huge victory. So I will lead there, but the crisis really began unfolding for us in the beginning of 2017. So, we have operated a hotline. IDP actually started as a hotline in our founder's basement in the village, and it has continued that tradition ever since. And in early 2017, we started to just see a flood of calls from folks in the community reporting all kinds of horrendous raids. And it became very evident that there was a pattern of ICE making really brazen arrests at courthouses. There had been a smattering of these kinds of reports in years past, but within the first year of the Trump administration, we saw a 1,700% increase in the number of ICE operations in and around New York State courthouses. And they were just reprehensible, right? I mean, it was, number one, very public, right? So folks that were in courts waiting for appearances would see, two beefy looking guys in plain clothes suddenly snatch someone, drag them away with their defense lawyer, panicking and asking and trying to invoke their rights. And these plainclothes officers just completely ignoring that. There were some very, very public reports of ICE stalking victims of trafficking at a special court in Queens that is really a model actually nationwide for how to provide support for trafficking survivors. And they deliberately went after 3 women on the same day in that Queens courthouse. And those brazen attacks, I think, were not, I think what was different about them is that everyone could see what they were doing and everyone could see through their narrative that what they were doing was in the interest of public safety. So that was for us, I think, a really big shift. As an organization that has focused on protecting the rights of immigrants who've been swept into detention and deportation because of some kind of contact with the criminal legal system, we have always really struggled to get people to kind of see past ICE's narrative around public safety. I think, once ICE pulls the, oh, well, they're a convicted felon card, it can be very, very difficult to continue the conversation, right? You can't get to the level of, well, actually, this is double punishment, right? Someone has already served their time. Or actually, what are they even calling a so-called aggravated felony? Let's unpack that, right? Like, you can never get to that because once they wave the public safety flag, people shut down. I think that what was so different about this is that people could really, in a unified way, see through that and see that what ICE was doing was actually the exact opposite, right? They were the threat to public safety. They were undermining the ability of survivors of intimate partner violence and trafficking to seek justice. They were undermining the ability of defendants to defend themselves against criminal charges, and they were making people scared to go to court. And so I think that what really made this ultimately succeed was just this tremendous coalition building that Sarah was, I must say, an integral part of. That was truly a statewide effort where a lot of groups that are often adversaries came together and just stood together and said, enough is enough. We're not going to accept this, and it's a huge win. So I think we're excited by it. But it took, unfortunately, a real attack, right, on kind of very, very fundamental rights for the victory to happen.
And one of the things I think that makes it different, you highlight this, is, I think if I remember, Manny's work helping to create IDP, that it really was about the civil and criminal consequences of immigration, or the effects on immigrants of a conviction, of a civil problem, sort of after the conviction, after the fact, after a plea deal. This was, this strategy was intimidating people, even who were witnesses, who might come and support the prosecution of someone who was a bad actor in the community. And this was keeping even them from the courthouse, to witnesses and victims. So that was quite a different change from what you guys were used to fighting around. Now I'm going to turn to David. Now, David, you don't have to talk about the Trump administration and fake news. You've written a whole book about it. I highly recommend everyone go out and read it after you go buy Crisis Lawyering. Amazing, amazing book. But your work is so fascinating in crisis lawyering. Lee, you said before about sort of a glib answer. I'll be a little glib. Lawyers like to joke and say, oh, I don't want to negotiate with a gun to my head, or, you can't hold me hostage. Don't hold my client hostage. Actually, David, you deal with people who are hostages. Like, your chapter is about working for the New York Times and trying to get people who are in war-torn areas of the world, who reporters and their interpreters and their drivers who have been taken captive, and they really are. This is a life and death situation you're dealing with. So. When you were sitting in the DAMC as a third-year law student, did you imagine that this is what you would be doing as a practicing lawyer? And how did your training at Albany Law School prepare you for what you do now with hostage negotiations?
Well, I was still trying to figure out the answers to Pat Rahan's exam at that point, so I didn't really have much else on my mind. But at first, I just have to say that I so admire, respect, and value the work that Lee and Sarah have done. It is really classic lawyering and taking the skills of a lawyer and applying them in such an important way to the neediest people in a system that can be abusive. My experience, of course, has very little to do with the law because it's by definition lawless in the way these things go. And much of what I write about in the chapter is about taking skills as a lawyer and applying them in a situation that isn't familiar in the way that going to court is, or making an argument is, or writing a brief is. But the answer, Ray, is I have had no idea. I don't like to brag about this. It's actually embarrassing in some ways. I didn't have a passport when I left Albany Law School, and I was no kid. I was 39 years old, and the most exotic place I'd ever been to was Montreal. That was about the extent of it. I once went to Tijuana. So it was a long trip for me over the next years to become engaged in this. And as many things have been said about the government here, I will say one positive thing, and that is part of my grounding became that during the Bush administration, for reasons I never quite understood, the State Department decided they should send me to various places in the world to talk about press freedom. So I went to Yemen for the State Department. I went to Jordan. I went to Bahrain. Went to Central and Eastern Europe. For whatever reason, the Foreign Service officers loved to have me talk about what a terrible administration the Bush administration was, which I was happy to accommodate them. So I actually, by the time 2008 rolls around, and I'm working at the New York Times, I've been at the New York Times for a few years, and one of my very lawyer-like duty was to head a committee on crisis management and then to engage in the equally lawyerly function of writing a report, which no one read, which most lawyers have experienced in their lives. And then in October of 2008, David Rode, one of our reporters, was kidnapped by the Haqqani family, a branch of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And nobody had been through this at the Times. Had never been through this kind of kidnapping where someone's actually being held for an extended period, and there's going to be demands made, as it turned out, for ransom, and David is taken into North Pakistan. But they turned to me because I'd written the damn report. And so that apparently qualified me. And it was really learning on the job and figuring out how to be a problem solver, how to deal with the dynamics of a family that was understandably concerned, how to deal with the corporate interests that were involved when an employee, just as with any company, was taken, but also the unique circumstances of working at a company that is in the business of telling secrets, not hiding secrets, who wanted to report on the developments of this, even though it would be detrimental, we thought, to David's best interest and the interest of his Afghan colleagues who were taken with him. So that was really my headfirst launch into this kind of learning on the job. And I think in many ways, being a lawyer complicated it because I was acting as a principal. I was acting as the representative of the company. And just because of my nature, when legal questions came up about various things, from employment law questions about David's status, to insurance questions and so forth, I tended to lawyer them myself, in part to keep a circle of confidentiality. In retrospect, that probably wasn't the smartest way to handle it, to be two-hatted. The thing I'd end with, or end this section with, is that in 2012, a Danish movie came out called A Hijacking, which is about the taking by the Somali pirates of a Danish tanker. And the critical moment in that movie is that the CEO decides because he is responsible for his people, are going to bring them back, which of course means that he does just a disastrous job of negotiating, violating all the rules for how to handle a crisis. He's in direct contact with the Somalis. He's subject to their emotional pressure, and he makes terrible, terrible decisions. I wish the movie had come out in 2007. I probably would have been smarter.
So one of the lessons I heard in there is, write the memo. Right, that you were part of the team, and then you ended up writing the report. And so for students out there, during negotiations, you write up the agreement. When you're in a committee, you take responsibility for writing the report, because then if you want the work to come to you, and it will, put your hand up, raise your hand, and get involved. So Eric, you've done a lot of work with lawyers at FEMA. So, and a lot of your work, comes from, working with governments internationally, in Sweden, other places, but mostly from the government side. So what you're hearing now is, someone in a private institution, people working, someone in an educational institution, someone in a nonprofit. So how does this, from other chapters in the book and from what you've heard so far, how does, the perspectives of lawyers from sectors other than the government sector, how does it line up with your experience working with government lawyers and their perspectives on things?
Unmute. That always helps. Ray, you put your finger on one of the things that has been most eye-opening and interesting for me in this work, because I started off looking at government lawyering from the perspective of FEMA, which has a largely humanitarian mission. And so government was, in that particular context, the good guy. And good crisis lawyering was often about being pragmatic, keeping the survivors' needs, the disaster survivors, the people who are in danger, or have been hurt, or suffer tragedy, keeping them their needs foremost. And bad lawyers, government lawyers who were too bureaucratic, who were too square, who were too slow, were a problem that could prevent people from getting the help that they needed. On the other hand, there were some lawyers at FEMA who were really good at that, at being problem solvers, and who had empathy, not only for the survivors, but also for the hard jobs that other people in the crisis team had to do. The person who had responsibility for the crisis communication. Lawyers often, instinct is don't say too much, don't take too much responsibility, don't expose yourself in court later. But if you're trying to win the battle of public opinion, or restore trust in an organization that has made mistakes, owning it is a big part of moving forward. And so that was the context that I started with. Later on in this work, I started looking at situations where lawyers had to be and that was true in FEMA too, pulling on the emergency brake, setting boundaries, identifying red lines, ethical or legal, that shouldn't be crossed. I remember an early conversation with somebody who was working with operational law of JAG in Iraq. He was saying that, well, in FEMA, good crisis lawyering was expanding latitude, but he felt that sometimes his job was to shut down operations that would be violations of international law and human rights, and protecting non-combatants. And so it turns out that this is much more complex. In this project, really taking a look at the people who hold the government to account and who help people who are vulnerable, like Lee and Sarah were describing, and who protect people from a government that perhaps is not always on the side of the good and the right, equally important and equally interesting. So why are these things similar? When we talk about these different cases and the natural disasters and the policing crises and the other types of issues that are in the book, one might say these are apples and oranges and grapes and kumquats. But what they have in common is that these are situations where there is a lot at stake, where there is time pressure, where there is uncertainty, and where people are taken out of their comfort zones and forced to solve problems individually or collectively, or apply their skills in ways perhaps that were not envisioned in law school or in traditional forms of in-service training. And that is true whatever side of the barricades I think that you're on as a lawyer. And in fact, another of the things that's very interesting about this is that different people in different organizations have different comfort zones. David was talking about the New York Times. This is an organization that works in a very high tempo and deals with sensitive issues and tries to hold the government, to account on a daily basis. And so the normal mode, much like a police organization or fire rescue services or emergency medical, is fast-paced. New York Times, a red light type organization or a blue light in many ways. And yet the problem set that David was thrust into dealing with was neither typical of what the New York Times was doing on a daily basis, nor typical of his professional training as a lawyer. And so he was outside of the box and outside of the comfort zone. And that, I think, is really the essence of the challenge. Crisis management, crisis leadership, crisis communication. These are extreme sports. And you need to prepare and train for that. And part of the book is to try to identify good practices and also to think also outside the box about how one could add to legal education and legal training and legal mentorship, and in order to prepare people better for these situations.
And we'll get into that. One of the things that we try to stress in the book and elsewhere is that a client crisis, apart from the empathy a lawyer might feel for a particular client situation, not every client crisis is necessarily a crisis for the lawyer when the lawyer understands the law that governs the situation, that has handled this type of situation before. One of the areas in which I used to practice was in eviction defense work, and a client would come. They had a notice from the sheriff that they were going to get evicted in a couple of days, and that was absolutely a crisis for the client. But I could probably prepare the papers to challenge that eviction and stay it, vacate the order, and get the client's tenancy fully restored. I could have those papers ready in about 45 minutes, and in the courts a half hour after that. So not every, again, apart from the empathy we might feel for our clients, not every client crisis is in fact a crisis for the lawyer if they know what to do, how to do it, when to do it. One of the things that distinguishes that type of crisis from a crisis that affects the lawyer is the uncertainty about the facts, the situation, the law to apply. So Lee, you're talking about working to prevent the intervention of ICE in the courthouses. And one of the things that's really compelling in your chapter is your efforts to develop situational awareness, right? For the lawyers on the ground to know what was actually happening. And I suspect that there were probably some rumors that went around at times, but how did the lawyers communicate with each other, both within the organizations in which they practiced, but also across organizations? How did that were all sort of, even, groups that were not natural allies who worked together nevertheless. How did you sort of, put together the situational awareness of what was happening on the ground, because you really needed and developed a rapid response to these incidents? How did you develop the situational awareness around that within the coalition?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of hard work and a lot of trial and error, I would say. I wish we had these systems kind of in place. I wish I could say that we had thought it all out and had the systems in place when we started, but we really didn't. We have a mostly volunteer operated in many ways hotline, as I mentioned before, and really just one or two dedicated staff attorneys at any given time that are available to take those calls. And what we were doing is that we were essentially telling attorneys to call our hotline whenever they were, saw something suspicious. And sometimes it was really, it was rumors, and sometimes the rumors turned out to be very, very true. And I think it was particularly difficult to kind of separate fact from fiction because the ICE officers were plainclothes. Right. And if you went up to them, even if an attorney, right, an officer of the court went up to them and asked them, are you here from the federal government? Are you here with ICE? They would refuse to answer. Can I see your badge? They would refuse to provide identification. So that made the situation particularly difficult. I think, luckily we had a lot of experienced defense attorneys, line attorneys from Legal Aid, from the Bronx Defenders, from Sanctuary, from Her Justice, from, all over the city, who I think had enough experience that they could almost, I hate to use this word, but in a sense, profile an undercover. There's a certain look to an undercover that can give them away to an experienced attorney. But it was a lot of people sending us text messages, people furtively taking photos and sending us messages. What ended up happening is that beyond the hotline, we started kind of informally with legal aid. We started a rapid response system within organizations so that organizations could report, between themselves what they were seeing. But it was tricky. I think that there was a lot at stake, though. That was something that we realized very quickly. And I'll just say, from like a legal education perspective, I think that you can't underestimate the importance of teaching someone fact collection, right? Like, knowing your facts and being sure about your facts is your credibility. That is the foundation for all of your advocacy. And so being able to, double and triple verify reports was essential to our credibility with the press. It was essential to our credibility with the Office of Court Administration. It was essential to our ability to, to also write affidavits and, of course, actually bring motions to terminate and all sorts of legal motions. So it was really, it was hard. And I will say that, I'm sure we'll get to this later, but it burned a lot of people out. I think that and I just want to mention that I think for so many attorneys, who do eviction work or who do immigration work or who work with folks that are charged with crimes, it is emotionally exhausting. And even though I think you may know in your head that you should separate the legal arguments from what your client is going through, I think emotionally it's a lot to be the person who takes those phone calls every day. It's a lot to be the sort of person who's expected to do rapid response and to see the text messages all the time. Like it's, it definitely, I think, has continued to haunt a lot of folks who documented those arrests.
So that's a really remarkable point and so true. Sarah, I know you've dealt a lot with these issues with your students, with your colleagues. So how do you deal with some of these sorts of issues, this vicarious trauma, which you talk about?
Yeah, we talked about it in terms of a term that people have been saying needs to return to our discourse generally, and that's empathy. I talk in the book about, I had just prior to this, I had been helping to represent protesters at the State House, protesting with the Poor People's Campaign, which was a different kind of movement lawyering, and was sort of in the mindset that law enforcement was not our friend and law enforcement was in the way. And this experience really forced us, all of the lawyers who volunteered on the project, to get an inside view of a jail, how it operates, and the people that work in it, not just the people who are captured in there, who are there against their will, and the people who come to work every day, who may be captured in their own way. And I'll leave that one sort of to the ether, because what I really want to talk about is what I say in the book, which is at one point on a pretty routine tour of some offices, one of the secretaries pointed to the wall of honor where CEOs who had passed away, their pictures were displayed on the wall, and she was going through
correctional officers, CEOs,
correctional officers, right? And she was saying, suicide, alcohol, dependency, motorcycle crash, and sort of like just sort of going through the line of people who had passed away under traumatic circumstances of their own. And there was a sense of shared pain of the whole system. The whole carceral system sort of came down on us in that moment in terms of understanding. And I know I see former students who are on this, who do this work day in, day out. They are jailhouse lawyers who hear the clanging doors of the bars in their sleep at night. And we couldn't just end the project with this feel-good story without bringing more to bear on that carceral system that primarily houses Black and Brown individuals, which comprise most of our client base in this crisis situation as well. And so thinking about what Derek Bell coined as interest convergence and how to bring very disparate points of view, regularly we were interacting, and by we, I mean mostly very liberal, progressive lawyers interacting with corrections officers in a small county jail in upstate New York and learning from each other. on a very human, granular level. There was a point where I had to jump in on the floor, and I was working with a mom who was separated from her daughter at the border, and she had in her fist, and they were still damp because of how tightly she was holding on to them, her kids' vaccination records and social security cards, which was like the only proof that she had, that they were hers. And they were, because they were US citizens, they had been released to family. And my job was to get those documents to the family, taking care of them until they could be reunited. And there was a corrections officer there the whole time, because this was happening in the waiting room where we were talking with our clients, and the corrections officers were moving people around. And he was sort of watching the interaction. And I looked at him and I said, you helped this happen. You helped a mother get, connect with her children. I don't think you can understand the gravity of what you've done, because he was, checking names. It was a lot of stress on them. There was a lot of pressure, in their daily job was upended. And we were constantly asking them for favors, and in and out all sorts of hours of the day and night, with emergencies of our own. And there were times that we all had conversations about what we liked on our avocado toast. And those are like conversations that would not ordinarily happen, especially at a time in our country when, someone with a Trump sticker on their watch band or whatever would not be regularly interacting with a New York City lawyer from IDP who was volunteering for the day. And those conversations needed to happen in order for us all to work more efficiently together. And so I think holding those moments up for the students, and I only speak to my experiences because I don't have permission from the students to share theirs, but they shared as well their moments on the floor where that happened. And of course, before the crisis, we had encountered a woman who had been picked up in a courthouse, who had left. She was checking in on a regular probation visit, had never been in a jail in her life. And because she was an immigrant, got caught up in ICE in the court. So it's just a convergence of a lot of different things. And when you can hold that up for students and say, you're interrupting this in a way that's helpful to everyone involved and bringing shared healing to a system of shared grief and pain, it feels a lot less overwhelming, I think.
So that's great and amazing, experiences for people to have. We've gone around in titles for some of these events, and we had originally said, one event would be Lawyers in Crises. And like, well, but wait a minute, that's got sort of a double meaning, right? Are the lawyers in crisis, or are they dealing with crises? And the answer is yes, both sometimes. Now, just quick second on that note, a little housekeeping. Here is our first word for your CLE. The name, the word from the old password, the word is crisis. All right, so that's your first word if you're getting CLE credit. Now, this work is very hard, absolutely. But I think that what comes out of all of your chapters and many other chapters, Eleanor's chapter, Pierre's chapter, that this is also rewarding. So David, is this work rewarding, or is it just a grind? The crisis lawyering aspect of your job, which are there any aspects of your job that aren't crisis lawyering? But let's talk about the crisis lawyering aspects of your work.
It's a pretty narrow corner of my work, as you know, and it's completely exhilarating when it works out. It's devastating when it doesn't. To be involved with anything that's consequential, to do something difficult and do it well, whether that's a crisis or just a hard case or anything else, that's really the subject of reward. I just wanted to reflect on a couple things that have been said, if I might, Ray. Eric's point about inside FEMA was really interesting to me, because I now exist in a world within the times that is a little bipolar. On the domestic side, we have a crisis management operating team, which reports to another committee, which then reports to the executive committee. And there's this elaborate planning and so forth that goes on. And I'm sure that's effective. On the international side, though, it's much more a fire department sort of response, that we are a tiny number of people who kick into action and make decisions and move. and which is much more my style than sitting in committee meetings. And in some ways, because I happen to stand at the intersection of corporate New York Times and newsroom New York Times, I'm almost ideal because I can motivate corporate resources, but I have credibility in the newsroom, and it works like that. I was once talking to somebody who did crisis management in the Silicon Valley for a company, and I was asking her about this tension between, do you have a plan and a committee and bring everybody to the table, or how do you do it? And she gave me a very, very Silicon Valley answer, which is, I went out and found the 5 smartest people in the company. I didn't care what they did. I made them my team. And if anything happened, I'm going to call those 5 people, because whatever their professional background is, whatever their portfolio is, these are people who succeed, who know how to do things, and are going to respond and find the way to get to the right answer. The other point I wanted to underscore was the one that Sarah was making, which is really the give a damn point, and that it is stressful to care as much as lawyers often care. Good lawyers often care about their clients. It is stressful. You feel their pain, and there are clients who take advantage of you, who see that you're feeling their pain and want to dish out a little more pain for you to feel. And so that there is a balance to be struck. But by and large, giving a damn is a grace note in anything you work on. It creates goodwill when you aren't as good as you should be. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel human, not just a technocrat, but a person who has skills. I talk about in the book about Mohammed Shaglouf, who was killed in Libya. He was a driver for 4 journalists who were taken by the Libyan government, and they ran into a checkpoint during the civil war in Libya. The 4 Western journalists were seized by the Libyan government troops. Mohammed was shot and killed. But nobody really knew what had happened to him at the time. And after our 4 people were released, came back, my colleague Chris Shivers, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter and former Marine, and I made it our business to help the Shaglouf family. Mohammed Shaglouf had worked for us for 1 day. He had been hired that morning. We had no connection to him. But we felt, and Chris certainly emphasized this in a way that a compassionate person, an ex-Marine, would think about it, is that we owed something to him and his family. So we attempted to go out and find out what happened to him. His family thought that they had found his body in a burial ground. They collected DNA. They gave us DNA through a series of strange events, which we don't need to go into. We ended up carrying that DNA. We ended up having our security advisors carry that DNA sample from Libya to Australia to be tested. And when the results came back, it wasn't him. The body was not the son that they were looking for. And I was the one who had to tell the Shaglouf family that. And it was very hard. They were so invested in this and invested in us and trust us. And I sent them an email explaining that there was no chance it was their son, that the test just wasn't close, according to the lab in Australia. And I didn't hear from them, and I just assumed they were devastated. And then a short time later, I receive an email. I look, and it's from them. And his brother, Mohammed's brother, is writing to me because he's heard about Sandy doing all the devastation on the East Coast, and he's checking to see if my family's safe. And you remember that more than 100 other details of things that happened during a very stressful time. And in the end, you're glad that you reacted that way, that you gave a damn and you cared about people.
That's remarkable. And I think it is easy to think of the lawyer as a technocrat and supposed to respond in a non-emotional way and to stay calm at all times. And And sometimes that's really hard to do. And you can't leave your humanity at the door when you walk into the office. I think that that's really important for any crisis lawyer.
And Ray, can I say one more point there?
Absolutely.
Because I just want to follow up on Lee's point, because Lee's point was right about collecting facts and knowing what you're talking about.
I thought that would a newspaper man would like that.
Well, it's one of the things. When we were having an organizing session for one of these, somebody said, "What's the one takeaway that people should have?" And for me, it's the pause. And it's the pause because you know where you hear something and you want to react to it, or you're emotional and you want to react to it, and learning to pause, to get the facts, to not be taken in emotionally is so important, because I'm not that kind of person naturally. I want to respond. And it's just giving yourself a chance to say, is what this person telling me the truth? Or if you're being yelled at, which happens in these situations, there's a lot of tension, or people are mad with you or second guessing you, or they have a better plan. Your normal reaction is to say, I'm working really hard. I'm doing the best I can. If you can do a better job, you do it. And that's when you really should say, let me process that.
That's great. Yeah. I think that's thinking fast and slow is a great way to think about that approach to it. So Lee, I'll go around sort of in a lightning round on this one. Knowing now what you knew, knowing then what you know now, anything that you do differently?
That's really interesting. I guess to build on David's point, maybe I would have paused more. I think that is definitely not my temperament. I will say that I think came out of a lot of meetings with elected officials, with members of the Office of Court Administration, very frustrated, very hot-headed. And I think in retrospect, kind of knowing that victory, now that I see that victory was actually possible and that all of those folks played some role in it, really, I might have been more level-headed. I will just, I'll just call out that I think that we really, spent a lot of time building a relationship with the Office of Court Administration, and in particular with the Chief Administrative Judge and the Chief Judge, who really, the victories that were ultimately won were not possible, could not have been possible without them. And I don't think I saw that in the beginning. And that is something that I think I see now.
Yeah, I think that comes across in almost every chapter, about building relationships, even across the aisle, so to speak, with who you see as your adversaries, but building relationships with people who can support your work, but also making sure you have a relationship, and what Sarah spoke to so eloquently before, seeing the humanity even in your adversary, and looking for that interest convergence that Derek Bell talked about. So Sarah, how about you? Knowing then what you know now, you'd have your database would be up and running. You'd have what else would you do? And it sounds like you're about to be back at not quite square one, but you're about to start in again. So what are you going to do differently this time? Let's phrase it that way.
Well, and all of this is iterative, right? We used the lessons learned on the ground at JFK in response to the Muslim ban. We had some of the same volunteers helping to coordinate as air traffic control, metaphorically, for the detention outreach project, just in a different part of the state. So this time around, we're taking a look at what lessons we gleaned in order to build an even better system for another problem, right, coming down the pike. But I'd say I would push harder with stakeholders that I think I could trust, right? So there were times when we hesitated, or there was a little bit of, I'm a skeptic, and I don't trust law enforcement in particular. I'm not going to say that that's changed tremendously, but I will say that, like, when you meet a friendly from the side that you're not used to working with, it's okay to test the boundaries to see if you can get more leverage for your clients. So for example, it took us several weeks to get access to a language line. We didn't realize that the sheriff's office was willing to provide that to us and make it secure, which was our question, right? Can we still have privileged communications? We didn't realize that we could have a printer in the visitor center. We didn't realize that there was a budget. Down the road, once trust was built, the sheriff ended up using funds that he had for people who were recently released from detention to help a woman who was released, who had been transferred to the federal Buffalo detention facility. And when they release people, they drop them off in a parking lot at a gas station, literally. And that's it, with whatever they have in their hands, and no money and no way to call anyone. This client happened to have the number for her pro bono lawyer that she had been connected with in Albany, called the lawyer activated our network. I get a Slack message at 10 o'clock at night saying we have a client who's stuck a young female client in the dark in Buffalo with nowhere to go. And by that point in time, I thought, well, I'll go out on a limb and call up the sheriff. And my team said, really, is this something he can do anything about? And I said, I don't know. He's been able to fix so many other problems. And he sent a deputy to get a special credit card to buy her a room and something to eat, and got on the phone with her and talked her through some safety procedures about how to keep herself safe until she could get on a Greyhound bus to see her family in Minnesota. That was not something I had expected would happen 7 years ago or at the beginning of the project or ever.
And it wouldn't have happened without the relationships you had formed.
Right. And all of the trust building that we had done through the 6 months of the project.
Yeah. So David, let's riff off that a little bit. What's the role of trust in a crisis lawyer's advocacy?
Well, if you don't have it, everything's harder. It's absolutely so. And just a couple of things I would say related to that. It's a little bit like writing your syllabus, Ray. You should set out from the beginning how you intend to proceed. That if you set expectations at the beginning, you're going to be much better off. The first time I did this, I had not really had a conversation. The first kidnapping, I had not had a conversation with David Rhodes' family, and had understood who's going to do what role, and let's figure that out. Am I going to be making the calls, or somebody else? Are you going to make the calls? How are we going to work that out? And the next time somebody was kidnapped, had a very, very good beginning conversation, explaining exactly what my role was and getting clear on those understandings, because it's very hard to do it in the moment. And so setting forth in the beginning, setting those expectations, living up to those expectations, important. Somebody's put in the chat about fatigue, and that too, I think is important. That I think there's an instinct by all lawyers that if you just work another hour, if you work a little harder, if you do one more thing, that's the answer. And folks, you have to take care of yourself. You really become worthless to yourself and everybody else if you have allowed yourself to essentially run out of gas, to become fatigued, to lose your perspective. And part of that is a different kind of trust, and that's trusting yourself. And it took me a long time to get there, but it's really important that you cannot guarantee what the results are, but you have to have confidence that you've made the best decision you could. You can't judge by the results. You have to judge by your knowledge that you have done what you needed to do. And if it works out, good for you. If it doesn't work out, good for you. You did all you could. And finally, it's helpful in all these situations to understand that you're in for the long term, that you're not going to get immediate satisfaction. You're not going to get immediate victories. You take it a step at a time. I would get calls from other news organizations about somebody had been kidnapped, and their first reaction was to just demand the release, which is if you're thinking about it from a negotiating standpoint, it's a really tough position to take. You're going to have really weak adversaries in any negotiation to have them, oh, sorry, I'll drop my case. Oh, no problem, I'll let your guy go. As opposed to looking for those things where you can begin. Give us proof of life. Let us on the phone with the guy. whatever it might be, something that would be a relatively easy give for you, for them, and meaningful for you. And if you've ever worked with a really good mediator, you've seen this. You know, the other side comes and says, we want $4 million, and you say we're going to offer 150. You're ready to go home. You know, like really, you're going to offer 100. It's 150 to 4 million, and a good mediator says that's progress. That's good. Let me go talk to the other side.
So, you know, it's interesting to sort of think about, you know, what, you know, you talked about, you know, putting things in place. Is there, you know, I think that every lawyer, particularly today in the middle of the pandemic, you know, every lawyer is a crisis lawyer. Are there ways, Sarah, you know, how do you teach your students around this? Lee, what do you talk with the, you know, sort of the newer lawyers and the law student interns? You know, can you plan for crisis? Can you, even if you don't know what the crisis is, are there things that students can do now, that you know, new lawyers, that experienced lawyers, are there things that a lawyer can do to plan for crisis? What do you think, Sarah?
I think it's important to keep track of the connections that you're making. There were a whole bunch of very random connections that came together in order to make the detention outreach project happen. And each of the connections that I brought together early on all had extra connections too. And that all of that ended up bringing about a more successful project in the end. I was a relatively inexperienced crisis lawyer per se, beyond the individual crises of our individual clients. But my network wasn't. So if you are in a field of practice where crisis happens to other professionals, or not to them, but other professionals are involved in responding to crisis, you know, talk to them and learn from them, and see and develop those relationships and make sure that you're keeping track, so that when something hits, you can say, oh, who in my Rolodex, I still have the sheet of paper where I started furiously scribbling down all the different people that I needed to reach out and talk to that first day. And I keep it because it's a good reminder of how, even early on in your career, these were all people I had maybe met in my first 3 years in Albany. And I've been here now 10 years. So just keeping tabs on who you're talking to and what their networks might be. And that's, you know, nobody really logs into LinkedIn anymore very often, but like sometimes it's very handy, and that's your virtual Rolodex. And it's also important, I would say, to maintain connections with people. I have a great relationship with Bridget Carr, who's at the University of Michigan, and she's a human trafficking clinical teacher. And so she's been like involved in high-speed chases in developing countries, chasing down human trafficking rings, like insane situations. And she's developed a habit and a practice of surrounding herself with people who are working on the internal vicarious trauma management and developing her own best practices skills, which she carried on to me, in order to make sure that when crisis strikes, you can take the pause, because you know how to slow yourself down, and you know how to keep yourself grounded, and you know who to surround yourself with. And those are two really big things that I feel like we all feel like we have to solve it ourselves. And instead of self-care, I think of it as community care. We're taking care of each other.
Terrific. So the second code, quickly, lawyer. So your first code was crisis, your second code is lawyer. Let's do another sort of lightning round just to, before we close out. So what piece of advice, Lee, would you give to law students about, you know, should they want to get involved in this kind of work, crisis lawyering, or should they stay clear of it? And if they wanted to get involved, what kind of advice would you give to them? And I'm coming to Sarah and David. They're going to come to you guys too. So Lee, you know.
Yeah, I see someone put in the chat, volunteer, do pro bono. I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that even if you are going the firm route, absolutely you should find as many pro bono opportunities as you can. and I would say be open. I think law school does not encourage people to be to go off the plan. I would say, I also went to law school much later in life and was a little bit shocked at how planned out all these sort of younger people were. And I think it's really important to be open-minded, right? Like, life is not going to go the way that you think, and you need to have your eyes wide open for those opportunities. And it's not going to be waiting for you. So I would say that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like there's just a lot of serendipity to the way your careers are going to unfold.
Absolutely. So I'm going to come to Sarah and David, but if we have a few minutes for some conversations, if people have questions, we'll try and get them in, but certainly if you want to put something in the chat, and Eric, I want to turn to you if you have a lightning round question for folks. But back to Sarah and David, advice for someone thinking about doing this kind of work. What would you tell them? What would you tell your 27-year-old self just getting into this work? What should they do it, and if they did, what should they look out for?
If you are employed by an agency or an organization that gives you health insurance, you should go to therapy as a matter of professional responsibility. And I'm dead serious about that. I don't think we talk about it enough. And therapy is also preventative medicine. If you can go to a therapist and say, like, this is the work I do, and watch them go, whoa. And then, what are the tools that I can start developing myself and habits in order to be healthier in the work that I'm doing? I used to run the family violence litigation clinic before this, and that was part of me taking the job. Was as soon as I was on the payroll at Albany Law School, I found a therapist because I was like, this is going to be intense, and I'm a new mom, and I want to be able to emotionally navigate this terrain. And so I'm really sort of a evangelist for therapy.
I'll take profit. Yeah.
When you can manage it. And then there are great resources out there. I think you should add to your reading list things like Trauma Stewardship, which is an excellent book about how to be a trauma steward, meaning in any profession, like if you're in charge of other people's pain, how to do that responsibly. And then The Body Keeps the Score is another book. So have a solid reading list that you revisit over and over and over again to keep yourself healthy, and know when to step away, know when to stop, and to tell everyone, surround yourself with people who understand that. My whole team kicked me out of Slack for one night at the height of the crisis and told me to go to a Dave Matthews Band concert. And it was like the best thing they could have done. And I tried to get like situational awareness updates all night long, and they literally changed my password. So I was not allowed back in until the next morning. And that's the kind of thing that we need to do.
And what we would all do to go to a large venue and hear music right now, right? You didn't know what you were going to be missing.
I had no idea how lucky I was.
How lucky you are. So David, when you were just starting out in your career as a lawyer, what would you tell yourself?
Well, a couple things. One is that and I wish Sarah would come and get me off Slack. That would make my life so much better.
It's easy.
It wouldn't be one day.
Yeah,
it's easy until people go, you didn't respond to my message. They start. There's other ways to get. If it was the only way to get me, it'd be fine. I'm a big believer in comparative law because it is an insight into the way other people think. The other day in the class I teach at law school, that they have, we were studying privacy, and we read the European privacy decisions and the American privacy decisions. And it is such a window of why we're so different in our outlook. When you ask the question, why is it that you can take legally in the United States a picture from a public place through the window of somebody's house, but in Europe, somebody can bring a privacy claim for taking a picture on the street of them walking down the street, you start to understand very important differences about the different ways people organize their lives and the values they have. So I'm a big believer in that. I don't know where this comes up, but I always think that being a creative lawyer has really been important. I like to think I am one, not all the time, not enough, but I was very proud of a pro bono matter where I was able to convince a federal judge that somebody was in jail wasn't in jail because he was being punished for his prior term, and then it had run while he was on his new term, and the Bureau of Prisons couldn't discipline him for what he had done under the prior term. He had left prison, although he hadn't. And that's, being able to see those kind of things is when you start to feel like a lawyer.
Eric, to you. Do you have thoughts? Lightning round question for everybody? Unmute.
Couple of quick thoughts and then a question. So it was talked about before that it's so important to get the facts right, and it is so important to do the diligence to get the facts that are available to the extent that you can. One thing to keep in mind is that there is a fog of crisis. There are these uncertainties that Ray was talking about. And a lot of times the tempo of the crisis response is going to be such that if you wait for all the facts, you may actually miss the opportunity to influence the course of events. That's something that makes lawyers very uncomfortable. And so figuring out what the equivalent of crisis standards of care for physicians is, and what good crisis lawyering doesn't always look like the best professional practice in other contexts where the time frame or the complexity or the uncertainty is less. And that's something that good crisis lawyers have to come to terms with. And it is part of that self-care. And David was talking about not beating oneself up too much. I started off by talking about my colleague, Brad Kaiserman, now at the American Red Cross, former chief counsel of FEMA. He says a good crisis lawyer is solution-oriented, articulate, legally sufficient, which is not legally sufficient is the key word. That's in relation to the situation, and timely. Because if you come up with the perfect brief in 2 weeks, when the decision has to be made in 6 hours, you've made yourself completely irrelevant. And next time they're not even going to ask the lawyer to be at the table. If you're in a situation where others have the authority, the train is just going to move on. And so I think the professional challenges for lawyers is to find ways, this is more on the organizational side, but find ways of weighing in, of using your influence in the best possible way. My question then for the lightning round is to say, what is it that you were not taught in law school that would have helped you be a better crisis lawyer? Or were you taught everything that you needed?
You gotta pick on one of them, Eric.
David, let's start with you.
Well, I learned that Sarah was about to speak, and that was, we've mentioned this in a lot of ways, and I don't think it's something that necessarily taught, but having effective personal skills is really important, whether it's your colleagues or whether it's dealing with others. When I was when I was out in the interviewing for a summer associateship as a second year, I went to a law firm, big law firm, fancy law firm in New York. Felt totally intimidated. I had spent my life as a college professor, and now I was this old law student. And I said to the partner who was interviewing me that, I didn't feel like I really knew much about being a lawyer. I just was a professor, and this was so new. And he said, "We're all teachers. That's what law is. What you need to do is figure out how to use your personality to convince somebody to do something. If that's not what you're doing as a teacher, you're a terrible teacher." And I thought about it. I was not a terrible teacher, and I'd never thought of it in quite those terms, but it really is true, is learning how to work with people to get to the result you want. It's really important.
Yeah,
Sarah?
of course, I should have spoken because David stole my answer. Um, but I also see that someone put patience in the chat box, and I want to lift that up because as a law student, I was eager, and I was eager to know all the answers, and I was eager to be helpful, and I was eager to make sure. I remember being a second year law student maybe, and I was helping then City Councilman Cory Booker, now State Senator Cory Booker, with some low-income housing cooperative organizing in the Central Ward of Newark, which was where I happened to be living at the time. And I got up in front of this whole neighborhood of folks, and Cory was there, and I gave my spiel, and I'm a law student, I'm here to help. And a gentleman who was the leader of the community, I come to find out, stood up and said, I don't know where you're from, but in this neighborhood, we begin our meetings with prayer, which was particularly embarrassing for me because I am the daughter of a Lutheran minister and have spent my entire life beginning meetings with prayer. And I hadn't done my homework for that meeting. It was one of the biggest learning. I learned more from the community in Newark, New Jersey. No offense to Seton Hall, my alma mater, but I learned more from the people who lived in the community that I went to school in every day, I think, than I did a lot of days in law school. And so I think we need to do more to get our students out into the community surrounding the schools that they live in and work in order to really understand the impact of their work and how to approach it in a way that will make sure that they can be successful in causing the change that they want to see.
Lee, should we give you the last word?
Sure, I'll try to make the most of it. I think, it's important to know how to work with non-lawyers. I don't know why I waited until this sort of very last minute to mention it, but it speaks a little bit, Eric, to your point about needing to be timely and responsive. I think that the natural disposition of lawyers is often not cut out for crisis at all. And at IDP, I was very lucky to be working with a lot of non-lawyers, who had a very different mindset and a very different feel of urgency about the need to get the word out to the community, to educate people, to protect people. And that kind of pressure, that sort of non-lawyer thinking, that conflict, I think can be really productive. And so I think that is very much about kind of opening up your worldview and I think engaging in productive tension sometimes with your coworkers.
Yeah, that's great. So we did get a question from the chat. I got one asking for the topics in the book, other chapters. You can see in the materials that you have, you've got the introduction to the book, which goes into a little description of every chapter, but we've got chapters in there about the fighting the travel ban, about Guantanamo, about writing the Department of Justice's Ferguson report, dealing with the after effects of Katrina, dealing Eleanor Stein's chapter on climate change in New York State. We've got a chapter on crisis communication, a chapter on educating lawyers to prep for crises. So a whole breadth of topics. And as I said, you could see all of them in the introduction to the book. Eric, I'll give you a penultimate words, and then I'll take the last word. So go ahead, Eric. It's all yours.
I would like to build off of Lee's point, which I think is so important. Admiral Ted Allen, who I think is one of the finest operational crisis managers that our country has produced, talks about how outcomes in these complex situations are always co-produced. And it's not about one single profession or point of view, but it's about integrating multiple perspectives. The pandemic is a perfect example. It is a medical issue and it is a public health issue, but it's also an economic issue, and it's all permeated with legal issues about the balance between individual prerogatives and autonomy and and the collective good. And so that point about lawyers being a part of a team. Scott Westfall from Harvard Law School, who wrote the chapter that Ray alluded to about educating and training lawyers for crisis management, he argues that lawyers are not really taught how to work in teams. That for a lawyer, working in a team is often divide the assignment up into pieces. Everybody goes away, then comes back with their piece, puts it all together. Somebody edits it quick, and it's done. Not having those interactive, synergistic, problem-solving perspectives, and maybe that's one of those things that more could be done with at law school, and to help prepare leaders to get those interpersonal skills that David was talking about. I think I'll stop there. Great conversation, and thank you all for the opportunity to be a part of it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming in these COVID times. It sometimes makes these a little easier to do. I'm going to close. I don't know how my Steadicam is going to handle this, but I have two posters on my wall. One of them, if you can read it, the red one is sort of classic, right? Keep calm and carry on. But if you can see the green one, I don't know how well you can see it, but it says, get excited and make things. So it's the corollary to keep calm and carry on. And I think that those two are really central to crisis lawyering. Is you have to keep calm, but you also can get excited and bring about greater justice and better outcomes for your clients when you bring your passion, your whole self, your creativity, and your humanity to the work. And I think that that comes through the pages. It certainly came through the presentations of our wonderful panelists and contributors today, but also I think comes through every page of the book. And I hope folks will consider buying it or taking it out of the library. But hopefully it will inspire folks as it was inspiring to work with all the amazing contributors in this work. So thank you all for joining us today, and please do stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.